Welcome to the Histories of Northamptonshire podcast series, and this episode number 6. Recorded on location, each episode tells the story of one of the many and varied objects which are the focus of the exhibition A History of Northamptonshire in 100 Objects. The exhibition runs at the Northampton Museum and Art Gallery between the 20th of September 2025 and February 2026. Selected by local individuals, heritage groups and the museum's own curators, each object tells a different story from the county's past. And so, to our guest for this episode. Tell me who you are and what your relationship to this particular object is.
So my name's Chris Hasley. I really enjoy fossils and ancient life and organisms. So anything that is gone extinct, so something that these animals don't no longer exist. And I studied paleobiology, which is the study of ancient life at university. And I really am interested in the animals that no longer exist, such as mammoths, rhinos, dinosaurs in particular, and ichthyosaurs. But they're a lot older than the object we're looking at today.
You must have loved Jurassic Park.
Oh, I love Jurassic Park. I think I watched it countless times as a kid. It's one of those movies that I think sparked my interest in paleontology and fossils.
Right, you are definitely the man for the moment in that case for this particular edition of the podcast series. What have you got for us? What is the object?
So what we're talking about today is a woolly rhino ulnar bone. So it's the leg bone of a woolly rhino. It was found in a quarry in Northamptonshire. I think it was in the 1980s. So woolly rhinos are essentially, imagine a modern day rhino covered in fur. I like to think of them as just a giant woolly tank with a battering ram.
Very good analogy. Okay, a woolly tank with a battering ram on the front. What sort of era are we talking about in terms of dates relative to where we are now?
Yeah, so the woolly rhino of Northamptonshire, I believe, was from the Pleistocene era. So it's roughly 2.5 million years to approximately 11,000 years ago. So it's quite a large chunk of time. That period of time is actually quite interesting, as it's what considered the last great ice age. So there was periods of what we call interglacial expansion. So parts of the world were covered in glacial ice sheets, and then it expanded and it retreated. And the woolly rhino is quite an interesting creature because mammoths and other creatures developed these thick furs to help them live during these periods of intense cold. And during this period of time, you've got what we call megafauna, or giant mammals, such as modern day elephants and rhinos appearing. And now in the modern day, the only megafauna that really exists are those in Africa.
Which is a fascinating sort of comparison to draw, because rhinos now don't have fur. So there's almost a climate change reaction to the rhino that you're talking about and the rhinos that we see if we head off to South Africa or some parts of Africa or even the local zoo. It's the same fundamental animal, though.
Yeah, they're both related to each other. So the rhinos that existed in Africa, so Africa was still quite warm during the time, so that's why they haven't got their fur. But the rhinos that expanded and migrated outside of Africa and evolved in Europe, they needed to adapt to that icy cold climate, and so what they developed is they developed thick fur and maybe even thicker fat, just to be able to adapt to those environmental changes. What's really interesting as well is, obviously, about climate change, is one of the reasons the Pleistocene is quite important is it's one of the closest epochs to our period, to us. Humans evolved during this period of time as well. So rhinos these rhinos may have interacted with our species as a whole. And there is potential that it's a bit of a controversial topic, but humans might have even been the cause of their extinction.
Because of hunting? Or because of actually taking habitat away?
It's believed hunting, so it is controversial. So I believe the current modern day main argument is it was more of a combination of things. So climate change, warming temperatures, maybe loss of vegetation, and obviously hunting as well. So those combining factors probably drove them to extinction.
This is the histories of Northamptonshire. We're talking about something that most people today would limit to Africa, and you don't see many existing rhinos in certainly in the wild. How common would woolly rhinos have been in prehistoric Northamptonshire?
There have been quite a few of them. Their numbers at the beginning of the Pleistocene would have been quite large. There is, and I can't remember the exact date, I think it's roughly 40,000 years ago, 30,000 years ago, there was what we can see an expanse in their numbers, so their numbers did increase. And then around 11,000, 12,000 years ago, towards the end of the Pleistocene, they just suddenly disappear. Now, the only thing I will say is there are what we call fossil record biases, so those increased numbers could just be biases in the fossil record of what we're finding. But the Pleistocene itself is what Pleistocene means most recent, because it's one of the most recent eras to us. And so a lot of the fossils are well preserved, so you'd expect less fossil biases from the Pleistocene than I would maybe see in the Jurassic, which is 150 to 250 million years ago. I think those numbers are slightly off. I think it's 200 million to 120 million years, sorry. But that is quite far back in comparison to today. So these are really relatively new. If you still had some ice sheets, so obviously the stuff that we are finding in Northampton, you can find them all across Europe. So if we go to like Siberia, some of these fossils are so well preserved, they still have flesh, fur, even skin, to the point where we kind of know what kind of colour these animals look like.
You mentioned that this fossil was found in a quarry, so presumably it was found reasonably deep down. It must have been quite a trophy for somebody to discover in the first place. What sort of size of object would it have been relative to the rest of the animal's leg? We can see it in the exhibition, of course, but you mentioned, I think you said it was an ulna. So relative to the rest of the animal's leg, how big a part would that have been?
So I believe the ulna itself was roughly between a third to a half of the actual animal's leg itself. Now, it would also depend on how big the animal was, what kind of stage in its life cycle it was. And so these are kind of the information that we'd need more of the animal just to see and work out what we were dealing with. But I believe the ulna itself was the only specimen recovered from that animal, and so it would depend on obviously different biological factors.
So if it was the only bone from the carcass of the animal, the only bone from the skeleton of the animal, is it possible that the bone actually at one stage had got flesh on it, and it might have been early man who had hunted it and had taken it, and actually that's the remnants of a meal?
It could potentially be, yeah. There's been evidence found all across Europe of both hyena and man removing bones, flesh, taking that flesh and obviously eating it. I don't believe from what is on display there's any scrape marks on the bone. So normally when we see early man, would see potential scrape marks from old flint tools or old flint spears. I don't believe any of them are on that bone, so it might not necessarily be man that moved this bone. It could have been hyena or cave lion, because we had cave lions and hyenas in Europe during this period. There is also bears, although I can't remember when the bears went extinct, so they might not have been around at roughly this time, but so there are other possibilities as well for what could have dragged this down. And also, I think from what I was reading about the quarry, is it might have been a fluvial deposit, so it's also potential that the bone itself, the leg, has been moved from where the carcass was by water, so by rivers, and landed at wherever it was, and the rest of the animal was unfortunately now disjointed.
It's the only clue that we have to the animal itself. Chris, you mentioned that a loss of vegetation might have contributed to the species dying out. I know your thing is more dinosaur related, and we're talking about woolly mammoths and woolly rhinos and so on. You also described this as a tank with fur. What would its behaviour have been like? Was this a peaceful animal until it was hunted, or would it actually have been that kind of a or would it have been that kind of a tank that would have been somewhat aggressive?
So it's a really interesting question. So with animals that are extinct, it's really hard to distinguish behaviour. So we'd normally use things like modern day analogies, or we would look at maybe any fossil footprint tracks. Now we're really lucky because these animals are really close to the modern day. We do have some analogies that we can draw from, such as modern day rhinos. So they probably behave quite like rhinos. They're probably peaceful at first, but if you start bugging them, they'll probably charge at you. So they have that lovely big horn, really large horn. You start bugging it, it's probably going to go for you.
Don't tangle with this particular tank then.
Yes, don't tangle with the furry tank.
What's your reaction to the object, and why should this object have made it into the exhibition?
I think these kind of objects that are found throughout Northamptonshire, throughout Europe, throughout England, they're really important aspects of where we've come from, or also what's been here before. And it strikes a deep chord in my brain of what Northamptonshire was like, what the earth was like, before ice stepped forth, before even mankind stepped forth. And rhinos are one of those things where we had them all across Europe. Now we have them in Africa, and the African species are also going extinct. So it's one of those things where we look at the specimen, and you can take that understanding of it's important to know what existed beforehand, and what we need to save as well. Let's not have the modern day rhinos go extinct. Let's have something for our kids to look at.
So an ancestor to the modern rhino is now teaching us a lesson about what we do in the future for existing herds of rhino, and maybe taking better care of them for the future?
Yeah, so the good thing of the Pleistocene as well is it's considered a great resource for like climate change analogies and looking at that information. So as long as it sparks that curiosity for someone to go and have a look into what's going on or what was going on, it'll be really, really useful. So like I said, the Pleistocene preserves a lot of things in exceptional detail. So we have diatoms, foraminifera, pollen, so we can use that to work out how the climate changed back then, how those periods of the climate change may have affected woolly rhinos, and obviously how the climate is changing now. We've got global warming, how that's affected modern day rhinos or even just modern day mammals, and hopefully try and draw some conclusions how we may be able to help these animals just get through to the next period of time.
So from the remains of one individual, we've learnt about Northamptonshire as a place from millions of years ago, tens of thousands of years ago. We've learnt about an animal which has a near neighbour in the modern age. We've learnt a great deal from something that was found in a quarry, but has plenty of lessons still to tell us in modern day Northamptonshire.
Yeah, there's so much we can learn from these rhinos, because we get to see what lived here, we get to see how they interacted. Like I said, if there is any scrape marks on that bone, you can see that modern humans would have interacted with this rhino. I don't think there was any, but there are evidence throughout the world where we can see that. I don't know of any ones that have been found in Northampton, but there's certainly ones found in the UK. So that would suggest that, at least, our interactions were quite important back then.
So coming to the exhibition, bring a magnifying glass with you, because you might find something that the historians haven't yet. Chris, absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for telling me the story.
No worries. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to this Histories of Northamptonshire podcast. If you would like to find out more about the objects or listen to other episodes in the series, go to www.northamptonmuseums.com. Alternatively, you can visit the Northampton Museum and Art Gallery, where you can see the A History of Northamptonshire in 100 Objects exhibition for yourself. The Histories of Northamptonshire project is funded by Arts Council England as part of the National Portfolio Programme.